have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who'd know it all without debate and never change their mind. I asked him what of women's rights. He said in tones severe, my mind on that is all made up. Keep woman in her sphere. I saw a man in tattered garb forth from the grog shop come. He squandered all his cash for drink and starved his wife at home.
Welcome everyone to our Friday evening presentation. Clay had asked me to make a brief self-introduction, and it seems the information of highest importance that I can share with you about myself is that my name is Melanie Bayless of Edito, and that I have properly taken up the role of wife and mother, although to my discredit I only have 2 children, a daughter named Hazel and a son named Theodore. And you should know that I am now in thoughtful consideration of legally changing his name. We've spent the last day and a half exploring Roosevelt's attitude toward womanhood, women's rights, women in the workplace, and of course, his relationships with the women in his life, his mother and sisters, his 2 wives, his daughters-in-law, and his friendships and collaborations with powerful women of his era. To continue to highlight this Women in the Arena theme, we have an enlightening and hopefully entertaining evening in store for you. Our presenters have agreed to join us on the stage all together, so you'll get to hear their insights related to Roosevelt and the women in his life. In addition, we've arranged for you to experience a sort of fashion show with a variety of styles representing the constraints and conventions in ladies' fashion during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, throughout the evening, I will be interrupting the panelists to bring our fashion show to life and our women of the era and their constraints. We've been talking about and trying to make sense, as usual, of Theodore Roosevelt. But we thought it might be useful as well as fair to hear from Roosevelt himself. Our presenters will sit here on the panel with the president and ask him to clarify a number of his views, actions, and utterances. So if you have attended the symposium before, you're accustomed to a typically very spirited encounter on Friday night with our 26th president. We have asked him to do something a little different than before. Perhaps more to the point, we have asked him to tone down his usual rhetoric, to avoid speechifying, if possible, and to answer our questions with uncharacteristic quietness and directness. We're not certain he can conform to this modest request, but we shall see. My primary role here is to act as MC or ringmaster, depending upon if he follows our request. So once again, please welcome our presenters, Dr. Hamlin, Dr. Cordery, and Dr. Jocelyn of Western Michigan University. And finally, please welcome the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you, distinguished guests. What I'd like to do is start actually with a little bit of the fashion show and introduce arguably the most important woman in Theodore Roosevelt's life, and that would be his second wife, Edith Roosevelt. Karen Nelson has portrayed Edith Roosevelt for the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and we are pleased to have her join us again this evening, wearing our first example of period clothing. In most areas of her life, Edith was never the trendsetter, and therefore her attire is typical of evening dress of the former upper class. She has a low collar, actually common for the mid-1880s, and plumes, as we know, miles of acreage in her skirt. She famously reflects the constraints of women in all areas of their lives. Preferring to remain out of the limelight, she has chosen a demure blue for this evening's event. Theodore Roosevelt both worshipped and respected his wife and commented upon her figure in middle age, stating with obvious pleasure that she maintained her girlish figure. Thank you. Would you like to say something, Edith? No, she would not. I will tell you what Edith would have liked to have said if she would have spoken. She would have said, as a woman of my era, I believe that a lady's name should appear in print only twice, at her marriage and at her death. Thank you, Edith Roosevelt. I have another introduction for you. This is Jade Hecker. She's a former DSU student. She comes tonight dressed in the attire of a lady in mourning. As you can see, she's clothed entirely in black, a European custom that can be dated back at least to the Roman Empire. Rigid mourning etiquette was characteristic of the early 20th century, and the shawl or veil for ladies was typical. In stark contrast to adult mourning dress, children were often clothed entirely in white during the mourning period. As we know, Roosevelt's losses of his mother and wife Alice were significant to his experience here in Dakota Territory. And here we imagine the pain of his elder beloved sister Bamie, who also lost her mother and her sister-in-law that day. She mourned their loss while caring for Roosevelt's daughter Alice as he returned here to Dakota to recover. Many years later, her continued attachment to her brother is clear when on September 14, 1901, the date of President McKinley's death and Roosevelt's accession to the presidency, she wrote to him in a telegram.
To Theodore Roosevelt, Buffalo, New York. Please let your secretary telegraph me when you will pass through New York so I can see you, if only for a moment at the station. Also, when Edith goes to Oyster Bay. This is my second telegram. Simply longing to be near you all, Bamie.
All right, let's go to our panelists. Dr. Cordery, let's start with you. I so appreciated your discussion on the relationships with his family members, and especially Bamie. We know she was opinionated, intelligent, fiercely devoted to her brother throughout their lives. And it has been said that Bamie might have been president had she been born a man. So if Roosevelt had been born a woman, how about that with that relationship with Bamie?
Am I answering or is he answering?
Either one.
Well, I think it only best if we start with the president. We'd be interested in knowing, sir, more about your relationship with your older sister, Bamie. Could you tell us a bit about her role in your life when you were young and then as you grew older?
Let me say, first of all, that I chafe a little under your demand that I speak in calm tones. But I will do my best to modulate my usual exuberance. It's hard because when I come here to Dakota and see all of you, I'm reminded of how much one needs the big open spaces and the fresh air. I gave a speech here in July of 1886 at the behest of Dr. Stickney, the first ever 4th of July celebration in Jenkinson, when Jenkinson had a population of about 300. And in that speech I said, like all Americans, I like big things. Big prairies and forests and mountains, big railroads and wheat fields and herds of cattle too, big steamboats and factories and everything else. But with the grandeur of this place, with the bigness of America, with its mountains and its plains and the Mississippi River, the most fertile river valley on earth, this calls on us as a people to create a big and magnificent civilization. The bigness of the West requires us to have a bigness of character. And that is not at all easy to accomplish. Just to speak about my sister Bamie, she was an extraordinary woman, extremely intelligent and well-read, great analytic skills, an understanding of politics. Her political network was at least as good as my own. She was a spinster until she was in her early 40s. She had a crook in her back, and then early on she had lived in excruciating pain. So when I began to make my run at national office, at greatness in leadership, she effectively sacrificed her own life to mine. She made herself available to me in every possible way. Convened dinner parties, warned me when my own impulsiveness was possibly putting me in harm's way politically. She smoothed the feathers of people that I had ignored or couldn't appoint to high office. She was a sort of sounding board. The president in my time did not have a big staff. And so she served as a sort of sounding board for me and gave the best energies of her life to making my life a success. Not every man has a sister who's willing to do that. It's a very rare thing. And so I can only feel the deepest gratitude towards Bamie. It's not that I wouldn't have achieved all that I did without her, but I might not have. And then she did one truly extraordinary thing for me when I hate to talk about it, of course, but when in February of 1884, my mother and my first wife died in the same house on the same day, I was so overcome with grief that I felt that my life had been lived out for all practical purposes. I couldn't bear to see the little child as a reminder of what we had lost. And so I asked Bamie to do the most extraordinary of things, to take the child and raise it as her own. She possibly longed for such maternal responsibilities. The child needed it. It wasn't uncommon in our era for this to occur. But she did it. And let me just finish by saying that when I met my second wife, Edith, or shall I say, met her again, because we had been childhood friends and even childhood sweethearts, and I secretly proposed to her in the autumn of 1885, she made it clear that if we married the first child, little baby Lee, Alice, as you called her, would be coming to live with us, that she could not remain in Bamie's care. When Edith told me that, of course I saw the logic of it, and I would not have thwarted Edith. But I knew that it would break my sister's heart, and I had a difficult time explaining to her what had happened. I did not want her to blame Edith, of course, but probably I wouldn't have done this, and I so worried that it would be one of the great blows to Bamie's life. But with her usual stoic character, she said, "Of course, Theodore. Of course, that's exactly what should be done." And all she asked was to be a special auntie who could take care of Alice from time to time when we were too busy or when there was childbirth or other things going on. So if you think about that, think about your own siblings and ask yourself what sort of sibling has that level of devotion and self-sacrifice. I know of no other record of it in my own reading.
Mr. President, can I ask a personal question?
I thought that was a personal question.
More personal.
All right.
If that child of yours had been a son rather than a daughter, would you indeed have turned that son over to your sister to raise?
We don't know, of course, because it was a daughter. And I was thrilled that it was a daughter. I wasn't one of those men who's longing for a son and disappointed when the first child is not a son. I knew there would be more children. As you know, I believe in large families, and I assumed we would have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more children. And so I reckoned that the laws of probability would give us a son at some point, and did, by the way. But when my heart's love died on Valentine's Day, 1884, I suffered a form of grief that I cannot adequately describe. I had a little 2x3-inch pocket diary, and I made a large X there and said, "The light has gone out of my life." I was not posturing or feeling sorry for myself or or falling into some sort of literary mode. I meant it, and I did not know if I could go on. And when I went to the funeral a few days later, those who observed me said that I was in a numb state, just barely hanging on. So I came out here and buried myself in the West, but I couldn't raise the child alone. First of all, Victorian gentlemen living alone really don't do that. The social structure of New York did not really welcome that sort of thing. But even if it had, every time I saw this child, it reminded me of the happiest days of my life, and it reminded me of the loss, and the pain was unbearable. In fact, as I think you know, I seldom referred to the child by her name, Alice, because that had been her mother's name. I called her Baby Lee. So I think that if it had been a boy, we don't know, of course, because that circumstance did not exist, but if it had been a boy, I believe I would also have entrusted that child to Bamie. Now, maybe later, when he was ready to kill a quadruped, or to hike up a mountain, or to play point to point, then maybe I would have brought him in sooner, because it's not that I think girls can play these games too, and my children did, but a boy has a kind of a rascality that I think is different in character from a girl. You laugh. I'll tell you this, I do not trust a man who is not something of a rascal as a boy. I hope you agree.
Mr. President, may I ask you a follow-up question on that? Because one of the things I most admire about you is how you really were a standout among your peers of young men, especially at Harvard, and then also later throughout your early married years. So, of young men who took it as a given that men should sow their wild oats and do as they please while expecting pure wives. And you, from day one, always said, single standard, what's good for one is good for the other. So even though you would like a rascal of a boy, you didn't extend the rascality to certain parts of town or certain houses.
Well, of
What made you
course
so?
Not. I'm talking about getting in a fist fight with a ruffian.
I know, I appreciate that. But what made you so different from the rest of your cohort? What gave you this moral verve that the others lacked?
The answer to that is simple and clear. My father. My father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., Thee, we called him, was the greatest man I ever knew in the whole course of my life, and the only one that I ever feared. He was not a stern father, he was a loving father, but there was a certain moral sternness in his character, and there was an absolute prohibition of immoral activity of any sort. Had he known that I was flirting with young girls or frequenting the flop houses in New York or Boston, he would have took me aside and he would have said, this is not what I expect of a Roosevelt. He only beat me once or twice in my childhood. But when he did, it was a lesson that I was not going to forget. His character, I believe, was perfect. And he insisted upon that high standard of moral behavior for everyone around him. And he was unforgiving of people who took advantage or succumbed to temptation or showed signs of moral weakness or depravity. His view was that everything is a choice in life, that there are no excuses for misuse of alcohol or misuse of women. There's simply no excuses whatsoever. And so I wrote him letters at Harvard saying, I feel so fortunate to have you as a father. You are my best friend in life and my moral preceptor, and I will do everything that it is in my power to live up to the standards that you have set. And it reminds me of the first night I spent in the White House. You know, McKinley was shot. I came into the presidency through the back door, as it were. And I was living away. I was living with Bamie for a couple of weeks because we wanted Mrs. McKinley to have a reasonable amount of time to vacate the property. I didn't want to rush her out. She, of course, was terribly grief-stricken herself. And so I stayed with Bamie. But the first night in the White House, my sisters were there, Corinne and Bamie and their husbands. And we had this meal. And the butler brought out these yellow roses, saffronia roses. And I said, those were my father's favorite flower. There's something more than coincidence in this. This is a symbol of my father's standing over me and insisting upon my rectitude. And then I noticed that it was my father's birthday this first night that I spent in the White House. And for the rest of my life, I can tell you this: everything that I did or didn't do, every time I failed, every time I succumbed to the temptation of exuberance or impulsiveness, I would look over my shoulder at my father and ask, what would Thee think? And nothing, not even Edith, could bring me back to the ground like the memory of my father.
Is this on? It is?
Yes, it is, madam.
Oh, dear. Okay, so in terms of the males, or how you learn maleness, could you talk about your Bullock uncles?
My Bullock uncles, my mother was from Georgia. My father had gone down as a young man to Georgia. He's a New Yorker. Gone down and met this extraordinarily beautiful young woman. He probably, in the scheme of things, would not have wished to marry a Southerner. We despised the South. The South was the Confederacy that perpetuated slavery. And they can dress it up as states' rights if they wish, but it was about a fundamental moral failure of slavery. But my father fell in love with this girl, this young woman, and he courted her, and she agreed to marry him. Well, when the war came, we knew the war was coming. When the war came, my father very much wanted to serve in the Union Army, because he didn't just believe that it was one's duty to fight in a war of one's time, although it is. He believed that this was the most righteous and just war that had ever existed in the world. But my mother, Martha Mitty, was an unreconstructed Confederate. So there were some conversations that we overheard between them, because he was righteously for the Union and she was righteously for what she took to be the 10th Amendment, states' rights. Her brothers were dashing young men. They had her capacity for narrative and for adventure, and they became figures in the Confederate Navy. But because of that, two things. First of all, they had to leave this country, and they spent a fair portion of the war in Liverpool. And several of them, I think two of them, did not come back because it was not safe for them to come back after the war. I heroized them. I didn't appreciate their cause at all, but they seemed like dashing young adventurers, the kind of men you most want to emulate in life. And she built them up with her own stories about this. So I had great respect for them in spite of their choices. But my father, because of mother's concern about her uncles, her brothers, she convinced my father not to fight. As you probably know, it was quite possible at this time for a gentleman to buy a proxy to serve in the Union Army in his place. My father twice paid a sum of $300, quite a sum in those days, to hire a proxy, a mercenary, to fight for him. There were conscription riots in New York at this time, class struggle, because the rich were buying their way out of the war, and the war was being fought by working boys. And so this bothered my father, but he understood that marital harmony is essential to happiness. He did, however, joined an allotment bureau. He helped to create it. And here's what they did. He traveled around. He wasn't home. He wasn't someone who ducked the conflict. He just served the Union in a different way. He would go from army camp to army camp and convince the soldiers that when pay came, to dedicate a significant percentage of it to their families back home. You know, many of these soldiers would get their pay and they would drink it out or go to prostitutes. So he created a sort of foundation under which these young men could do 20% or 25 or 30% to go back to their families in Ohio or Vermont or New York. And so he traveled through the whole war doing that. He was a friend of the president, Abraham Lincoln. So I respect that. But I will say this, much of my motivation in life, and particularly after the sinking of the Maine in the spring of 1898, was based upon what I took to be, I hate to say this, I felt some shame in my father's choice not to fight in the war. I understand it. He is certainly not a coward. But I felt some shame, and when I finished my crowded hour at San Juan Hill, I wrote a letter saying, now, if I died tomorrow, I will have vindicated the Roosevelt family. And that was an enormous part of my own thinking at that time.
But could those uncles have filled in for you in terms of it was on your mama's side, but they were valorous military men.
Yes, but they were on the wrong side.
Oh, yes, not to say that they weren't heroic. Did they provide you a kind of avuncular presence?
I didn't see them much. The fact is, I barely ever saw them. We wrote letters, and my mother wrote letters to them, and she told stories. My mother, she deserves a great deal of credit in my formation because she was a kind of a raconteur. She loved to tell stories. She had a kind of southern lilt to her narratives and a certain level of exaggeration and the heroic in her character, for which I believe I took some of my own. And so she built them up in my mind. And if they had been Union men, oh my, I would have worshipped them. But I cannot respect even brilliant and able and even noble young men who fight for so ignominious a cause as the perpetuation of Negro slavery. It is simply that simple.
Thank you, President Roosevelt. We're going to bring it back to the ladies, and we're going to do it in fine form right now. Let's welcome another lady to our stage. Eden Jackson is a current student at DSU, and thankfully, considering what we've asked of her, has an abiding love for the stage and what it asks of her. Much can be said of women's undergarments and the various necessary roles they play in our lives, but let's consider this. What Eden wears represents a crossroads of women's dress and undergarments. Corsets had long been worn, sometimes to support a weak back, but if not for that purpose, purely for effect. That effect was to shape the woman's body into an idealized version of the female form, highlighting a tiny waist between breast and hips. And there's a whole talk in gender construction. Bloomers, by contrast, came onto the American scene in 1850-51, popularized, although not invented, by Amelia Bloomer. Bloomers were created to provide women more active freedom in their daily lives. They were originally worn under a small skirt, and eventually became an unnecessary accessory as women's styles adapted. Eden has a quotation from Amelia Bloomer.
Let men be compelled to wear our dress a while, and soon we shall hear them advocating a change.
Madam Moderator, I do not like you talking about shaping of women's bodies.
Thank you, Eden,
Breasts
for the striking
hips.
visual reminder that as far as women's undergarments are concerned, we have indeed come a long way, baby. The popularity of bloomers gave women the opportunity to engage in activities that their cumbersome clothing had made difficult or truly impossible. Bloomers gave women the opportunity to participate in a wider range of activities, providing women increased flexibility to engage in exercise or compete in sport which brings us to the Wild West. Selena Loveland, current student, is wearing a dress of a female rodeo star. Specifically, she's wearing a riding skirt patterned from the actual clothing of a bronc buster named Fanny Sperry Steele. Steele was a female rodeo star originally from Montana, so this type of riding skirt is called the Big Sky riding skirt. Selena will illustrate how the skirt adapts to riding a Western style instead of riding side saddle. It's like culottes underneath, so it has this flap that buttons over. Looks like a skirt. Magic. So cool, I want one. Female bronco busters were allowed to tie their spurs together under a horse's belly to help them stay on during a bronc busting show, but Fanny refused to ever do that, later saying that mine is the reputation of being the only woman rodeo rider who rode her entire career unhobbled. I confess, it is a record I'm proud of. Fanny Sperry Steele was the lady horse bucking champion of the world at the first Calgary Stampede Rodeo in 1912. A fascinating story from that rodeo is that Fanny drew a horse named Red Wing, which was a wild bronco, that had thrown and trampled a cowboy to death days earlier at the rodeo. When she was given a chance to draw another horse, she once again refused to be treated differently than the men. She stayed on, and it was on that horse at that event that she won the world championship title. Selena has a quote for us. Yeah, you go, girl.
To the yesterdays that are gone, to the cowboys I used to know, to the bronc busters that rode beside me, to the horses beneath me, I take off my hat. I wouldn't have missed 1 minute of it.
Now that was an outfit.
Oh, that was a great outfit. So she's an example of one of your favorite authors, the Louisa May Alcott, who said, "The emerging woman will be strong-minded, strong-hearted, strong-souled, strong-bodied. Strength and beauty must go together." You guys have any response to that? Any question?
Mr. President, did you find anything particularly admirable about Western women when you were here in the Dakotas?
Of course.
And were there differences between the Western women you saw here and the Eastern women you knew?
Yes, very much, because I have a stage theory of frontier. It's a little bit different from Frederick Jackson Turner's famous essay of 1893, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, but there's some similarity to it. So look at it this way, that the English-speaking people come to our eastern shores, and they cut down some trees, and they start some farms, and maybe build a church and a school and a government house. And then the most restless of them, the Daniel Boone types, go beyond to the next frontier, and they start over, and they kill the varmints, and they pacify the Indians, and they grub those trees and start again. And this process moves from frontier to frontier, and it makes us unique in the world. It makes us absolutely unique in the world's history. There is nothing like the American experience, and we gain it from this errand in the wilderness. Now, the difference between my theory and Turner's is that I believe there's more violence at the center of this than he, I think, likes to believe. But the point that he came to at the end of this extraordinarily important essay is, now that the frontier was closing, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed in 1890. No more frontier, a pocket here and a pocket there, but no significant band of untamed wilderness in the West. Then the question became, how do we maintain the American character if it was formed by the frontier experience when we are moving from a frontier life into a more settled and even urban life? And I have great doubts about whether we can maintain the virility and the vitality and the verve and dynamism of the American character when we begin to drink tea in Manhattan or Boston and hold our cups in a certain sort of way. Women were as important to the frontier as men, maybe more important. The first suffrage that came to women came in Wyoming. It was in the western states where women had earned their equality. They had shown that in these conditions they were fully equal to the men around them. They had proved this once and for all. And of course, in the West, they needed as many voters as they could. And so suffrage came to Wyoming long before it came to the rest of this country, because women had earned it. They had shown what it was like to be a complete, rugged human being in a very difficult circumstance. Take, for example, here, my friend Margaret Roberts. You might have heard of her. Margaret Roberts ranched in the Badlands. I knew her during my time here. Her husband, Lloyd, had wanderlust, and he told her one morning that he was going to Wyoming to buy some horses. From Wyoming, he wrote her a single letter, and then she never heard from him again. Now, he either deserted her, or he died in some sort of a saloon fracas, but he left her alone. She could have retreated back to Pennsylvania or Ohio or some other place, but she stayed, and she raised 5 daughters. She had 5 daughters with her husband, and she raised them all out on that frontier ranch, and she taught them character, and they were about as splendid a family as I met out here, and she did it without a husband. She did it because she had this extraordinary core of values that are born on the frontier, in which women's essential equality was proved. So the women I met here, how shall I put this? Edith, my wife, might have had a difficult time inviting them to the White House. Because Edith, as you know, was an extremely refined woman and a reserved woman and a woman of some very high social expectation for manners and deportment. And so these women, by those standards, were perhaps a little rough around the edges. Their teeth were not what they would have been had they lived in New York. There's weather-beaten faces from the incessant winds here. And the life here is hard. This is a hard life. No one should pretend that ranch life is a life of ease. It never is. There are accidents involving creatures. There are endless amounts of work to do. A rancher is never finished with his work. And she was living alone. And in addition to that, as you know, a lone woman in a place where there are many men and no women is going to be preyed upon by men seeking either wives or ignominious pleasures. And so she had to take on that burden as well as every other. She did not want to remarry, and she did not. So yes, the frontier was the making dynamic of the American character, but it was also a hastening dynamic for suffrage and for equality of women's rights and for the respect that women deserve, because there is very little gender separation on a ranch when there's a flood or the cattle get out or a bobcat gets into the chicken coop.
What about a character like Medora DeMore? Because she's from New York. She's from the East Coast. She's from New York, I think, right?
Yes.
And she lives out here. And what?
I don't speak for Medora von Hoffman de Moraes.
That's right.
Her husband, the Marquis de Moraes, was a very colorful figure, rich, frivolous, lacking focus, impulsive in every possible way, a very short attention span, an arrogance, a huge arrogance. He thought he was the lord of, as if he were in a French countryside, the lord of some sort of large feudal estate out here. So we were both, in some ways, patricians. I from a much, much, much lower order. But when I came out here, I humbled myself to be accepted by the ranchers and the cowboys and the hunters here. I wanted their love and respect. And I soon realized I could not get it by holding any social indifference or social condescension. In fact, they held the things that I had prided myself on against me. My falsetto voice, my spectacles, my habits, etc. And so they made fun of me. They made a good deal of fun of me. And I worked hard to convince them that I wasn't just another wealthy Eastern interloper who came here for a short adventure in the West and then would retreat for the rest of his life. I wanted them to take me as one of themselves. And in that speech I gave at Jenkinson on the 4th of July, 1886, I said, I pride myself that I am now as much a Westerner as an Easterner, and in fact, I consider myself one of yourselves. So the Marquis and I were studying contrasts, and he made many enemies, and he killed a man in cold blood. He was never convicted, but it was a cold-blooded killing. His wife was a wealthy young woman from New York, Medora von Hoffman. Her father was a German-American, a fabulously wealthy banker. My family knew their family a little bit back in Manhattan. She was almost infinitely more sensible than her husband. She was a crack shot, a better shot than he. She was one of the great horse riders of the time. She could ride side saddle or straddling a saddle. She was a great reader. And I heard you talking earlier today about Anna Karenina. I borrowed that volume from Medora von Hoffman, and we traded books back and forth. She was literate. She was one of the few literate people out here. So I admired her. But she made a very poor choice in her husband. But that's not for me to decide. I did not know them particularly well. They came and went. He had a very, very, very short attention span. But I admired her. But you know, she didn't, during her time here, begin to have babies. This troubled me. Later, yes, but here, you know, women, let me put it this way. Longevity was not in my time what it is in yours. And a woman's fertility was frequently spent, I hate to talk about this in public. A woman's fertility was frequently spent by the time she was in her late 30s or early 40s, worn out by miscarriage and birthing. If you don't start right away in a marriage to have your children, you greatly increase the likelihood of tragedy down the line. And so I believe that a healthy couple has a duty to reproduce. They should start early and have several children, not just one, 4 or 5 if possible. And I believe that is not just a personal predilection on my part. I believe that is important social policy, that we need a kind of a youth and dynamism in our race. And when people, I have no greater dislike than of the woman or the man who in the prime of their life, for purely selfish purposes, shirk from the duty of breeding.
May I ask a question? You paint such a lovely picture of these large families, and the family that you and Edith created yourselves seems really ideal, wonderful, loving, warm. Given this vision that you have of what a large family could be like, and was for you in many ways, why do you think so many of the women that you knew socially and that also were the women in your family did not choose as their top choice that same life?
Well, some of these women had been reading French tracts, French philosophy, continental literature, socialism, and so on like this. And they had been infected by effectively un-American ideas about family. That's part of it. There also was at our time, you need to understand it, I don't know how to quite explain this, but we began as sort of Jefferson's people. Everyone was living in farms and small villages. It was a 3-mile-per-hour world. There was a great deal of sameness in the economy. But after the war, after the Civil War, there was a kind of explosion of capitalism and industrialization. And it came upon us before we even knew what was coming. We woke up one day and found ourselves an urban industrial nation, and we looked around shocked that this had happened. These things take their own dynamics, and by the time you step back to look at them, in some ways it's too late. And so suddenly we'd gone to from being a kind of an agrarian subsistence nation to being a fabulously wealthy nation, at least for those who had wealth. And our cities were burgeoning, and millions of immigrants were coming in from all over the world, from Ireland and from Italy and the Slavic countries and Russia and so on. They were coming here for the American dream. And so this Gilded Age, it's sometimes called, this explosion of wealth and urbanity infected the leadership class, and they then became selfish and didn't want to lose their time in the raising of children and the rights of pregnancy and so on. And so they pushed it aside because they were selfish. They were shirking a moral duty. And in doing so, they're not only proving their unworthiness to be a leadership class, but there is at least a chance that if the Anglo-Saxon people begin to drop their birth rate precipitously, that other peoples, how shall I put it, who are less fully evolved will begin to outdistance us in reproduction. You laugh, but we know from Darwin that the survival of the fittest is the rule. And so the fittest people in nature, and not in culture, but in nature, are the ones who reproduce the race. They're the ones with immunities to disease, who with special strength, with character, with creativity, and so on. There are, for every extraordinary person in the world, there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of mediocrities. And so the extraordinary ones have a duty to reproduce for the good of mankind. And it's not necessarily the Anglo-Saxon people, although it usually is. So that was greatly important to me. So you have industrialization and the sudden wealth, the urbanization, and at the same time you have European ideas beginning to infect because people like Edith Wharton and others were going to Europe and bringing back a lot of subversive ideas, it seems to me, and they were not family-friendly ideas. What makes this country so extraordinary is family. If you go to Britain or to France or to Germany, there are families, of course, but family does not have a kind of sanctity there that it has in this country. We specialize in family, and we need to honor that because that, in my opinion, is one of the things that has made this country so great.
Indeed, the strength and courage of Americans makes our country great. And so we have another final fashion show participant for you. And this is our suffragist. She wears clothing that sharply contrasts the flapper lady costumes of the 1920s, when women were finally granted universal suffrage in the United States. When you look at most historic images of suffragists, their clothing looks nearly exactly like something Edith Roosevelt would approve of. Modest, high collar, longish skirt, proper hat, and of course this makes perfect sense because the fierce battles were fought during the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So when seeing the buttoned-up proper clothing of the suffragists, it's just a reminder of the broad sisterhood of women throughout the decades and indeed centuries who kept women's suffrage in the conversation. Sarah has a quote from Jane Addams to share with us.
I am not one of those that believe, broadly speaking, that women are better than men. We have not wrecked railroads, nor corrupted legislatures, nor done many unholy things that men have done. But then we must remember that we have not had the chance.
Do you have other questions?
Okay, so how is it that you came to suffrage? And how did your thinking evolve on that?
I was tepid the term that comes up again and again in my correspondence on this subject is tepid. I was lukewarm. Because I don't think, look, I think it's been established today that I believe in women's equality and women's rights. My senior thesis at Harvard is unmistakable. You can't find any weasel words in it. It expresses what I thought. It says that in a marriage, if there is duty and obeyance, it cuts both ways, that it's not that the woman, not in some sort of Pauline sense from the New Testament that the woman is subordinate to the man. I reject that. That a woman need not necessarily take her husband's name in marriage, that she should, if she has a special talent or vocation, have the opportunity to work outside the house, particularly in nursing and other things that help along other families in our culture. I believe that women should be paid for their work, and if they do work that men do, if they do it with the same gumption, they should be equally paid, and so on. This is unmistakable. Now, you could say that this was a senior thesis and I was just tossing up some trial balloons or something, but that's not how I feel. I believe that women are equal to men and in some respects superior to men. But I certainly think that their equality must be protected. So the question is, does that imply suffrage? Now, I know you all think it does, but it doesn't necessarily. And many of the women in my world who were strong, independent, vibrant, opinionated women did not favor female suffrage. Why? Because it's, in a sense, it's a distraction from more important issues about the health of milk for our children, about child labor laws, about laws that protect women from unspeakable conditions in shops and in industrial plants, basic nutrition questions, law and order questions, domestic violence questions. I can make a long list of questions that are more important to me than suffrage, which I see as symbolic, not inevitably productive of what those who make the claim for it think it will do, and as I say, a distraction. But as I went on in life, I met extremely interesting and strong women, among them Jane Addams, and I once finally said to her, I think it was in 1911, if it works for you, it works for me. And I got on board with suffrage and became ardently in favor of it. But I do, even while being in favor of it, have some doubts about whether it is the be-all and the end-all of women's equality. And I don't just speak as a patriarchal man, I speak as someone who is surrounded by women who had strong opinions about these things, including, for example, my wife Edith. I could be wrong. If suffrage enables women to be in the arena to affect the equality of circumstance that they deserve, then I'm of course for it. And I suppose the case could be made. Certainly, I'm not one of those who think harm will come from suffrage. It's just a question of what are your priorities. You know, there's a limited amount that can be done by way of reform. You could make, I was the Bull Moose candidate in 1912. When I left this country in 1909 after my second term, I was moving into a more progressive phase of my life. That continued and accelerated in 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, and it was only checked to a certain degree by the coming of the Great War, where we had much more important things to think about. But I'm a reformist, and I became more of a progressive and more of a reformist over time, and something of a true feminist. But I believe that in any society, you have to take half a loaf because that's what you might get, that the great often gets in the way of the good, and that there are only a number of reforms that the public can stand before they grow tired of the advocates or grow tired of the movement. And I'll say, and I don't think any of the women who appeared on this stage, certainly not all you, exemplify this, but in every movement, whether it's suffrage or anti-smoking or prohibition campaigns or vegetarian campaigns, there is the bulk of reasonable, intelligent, well-meaning people, and then there is the lunatic fringe. And the lunatic fringe spoils it for everybody with the insanity of their views and the righteousness that they show. I coined the phrase lunatic fringe because I believe that otherwise worthy reform movements have been damaged by extremists who can't see straight and want everything rather than that which is possible. For example, I believe that the greatest president, without question, is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln did more for our Negro brethren than all of the abolitionists who ever lived on earth. And they despised him. They sat on their bluffs looking down in righteousness at him and regarded him as a temporizer and maybe even a racist and somebody who was doing the minimal amount to get on board with emancipation. But Lincoln's the one who did it. They couldn't do it. Lincoln knew that politics is the art of the possible, and he became one of the greatest men who ever lived because he understood that principle. And the purists, the righteous ones, the mugwumps, and the lunatic fringe never understand that and frequently damage otherwise essential reform movements.
I have a question. We will open it up for questions from the audience. I do have a question to begin on that. Throughout the late 1890s and until your death, you saw state legislation that increased women's suffrage. What would, if you could have written something or anticipated what the future would look like, what did you expect 1950, 1970, 1990, 2020 to look like for women? And equality.
It's an impossible question because, as you know, I died in the first days of January 1919. And it's impossible to know what any man would have done or thought beyond his time, or woman either. So I don't really want to be drawn into that, but I'll say this. I was not as concerned about women because I do believe in the equality of women, and I believe there are strong women, and there were strong writers and strong reformists and nurses and even politicians in my time, and they were doing just fine. And some of the rest of us who were progressive men were just trying to keep up. So I never had any doubts about the long-term status of women. The things we needed to get done were child labor laws and the 8-hour workday and workmen's compensation for those injured on the job, particularly women. Because if a woman's going to be a mother, she has to have reasonable hours at the workplace that will allow her to get home to take care of that more sacred duty in the family. So I had great optimism about the future of that. But here's what I think I actually would have thought. I'm going to be careful here. African Americans were in a very difficult position in the United States in my time. Free, but not really. Jim Crow taking over much of the country. Lynchings, 144 lynchings per year during my first term. When I invited Booker T. Washington to supper, the response was so appalling that it really lowered my respect for some parts of the American population. And I myself believe that Negroes, we called them black people or Negroes then, were not as highly advanced in their culture as their white counterparts, and I believe that it would take hundreds and even thousands of years for them to catch up. It was in our interest to make them catch up, of course. But we would have to be patient in the face of this. That you couldn't expect this to happen overnight. And so I think I would have been more impressed, I'll be interested to hear what the historians say, but I think I would have been more impressed by civil rights following my time than by women's rights, because I think women, however much they may feel, and justly, subordinate in American culture, it is nothing compared to the status of black Americans. Should we take a question or two from the real people? Anyone have a thought or question?
Over here.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Mr. President, during this event, in the 2016 Symposium, the discussion came up with the campaign of the present president to Aristotle of campaign.
Well, again, thank goodness I've been dead so long I don't have to answer your question, because I don't see any good coming of it. But I'll say this, that I was an impulsive, bombastic person who often spoke before he had really thought it through. Edith played an enormously important role in pulling me back. I was something of a bully. I spoke in platitudes. I once wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge and said, I know I speak in platitudes all over this country, but you try campaigning in 200 cities. And platitudes are what people understand. They're not in these rallies for subtlety and nuance. And so the very process of politics reduces a person to a series of bromides and talking points, and it may not be healthy for the Republic, but it is what it is. I think that the important thing for you to remember is that, and I mean no disrespect, but it is at least possible that I was the best intellectually prepared person who was ever the president of the United States. And that includes Jefferson and John Adams and John Quincy Adams, three of the giants. But think of that, I might possibly have been intellectually the best prepared president in your history. And I will just say, I don't think anyone will ever say that of the current incumbent. That doesn't mean that there are many different types of leadership. I'm not saying that there's only one brand of leadership. Certainly that's not true. But I'm saying that the analogies are shallow ones that don't hold up very well. And I don't like to be compared to anyone. You know, I believe the greatest president on our history is Lincoln. The second greatest president is Washington. I think Jefferson does not belong on Mount Rushmore. I think he should have been a president of a female academy somewhere. I can't call myself one of the great presidents because there was not a fundamental national crisis during my 7 years and 171 days as president. To be one of the great presidents, you have to go through what Washington did or Lincoln did. But I had peace and prosperity. There were important things to do, conservation and the Panama Canal and the Pure Food and Drug Act and a whole range of things. But these are not the stuff of greatness. The stuff of greatness is helping a great people get through an especially trying time. And that just didn't come to me. I'm not asking for it. But I would have loved to have been the president of this country in 1916 when Wilson entirely failed to prepare us for the war. He lied to the American people. He did not prepare us for a war that was inevitably going to come. When it did come, we weren't prepared then. We got in late. We lost our capacity to control post-war events. No greater dereliction of presidential duty, I believe, has ever occurred than Wilson between the time of his reelection and the time when he finally, reluctantly, brought us into World War I. Had I been president, it would have been a very, very different war. So I don't believe the comparisons really are very useful in this regard. Is there another question? Yes, yeah.
Mr. President, you said that if it weren't for your experiences here in North Dakota, you probably wouldn't have been president. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Of course. Were it not for my experiences here, I would never have been president. I think that's indisputable. Now, it wouldn't have had to be North Dakota. It could have been Montana, it could have been Idaho, it could have been Colorado. It just happened to be North Dakota. The railroad could get me here. I wanted to kill a buffalo. I knew how to get to one because there was a small herd still here. The only other way I could have done it would have been to go on the UP west of Omaha, and then I would have had to take a carriage ride or a stagecoach ride up to the Black Hills. And so if you want to kill a buffalo in 1883, there are only a few ways to get to one, and one of them was the Northern Pacific Railroad, and that's what brought me here. It could easily have been Montana, and it was only a few miles short of Montana. In fact, where I first shot my buffalo down near Marmarth, I was on the line between Montana and North Dakota. It may well have been in Montana. We did not survey the site. But here's why. I learned that average people have character. They may not know Latin. They may not know their Linnaean binomials for the creatures that they see. Their grammar is by no means adequate. But they have character, and they're particularly outstanding in a crisis. This is a place where a man's handshake is his word. I'd never seen that before. The people here work hard. As you know, if you're a Dakotan, it's not easy living here. The people here work very hard. They've earned what they have. They don't have much, but they've earned it, and they take a real pride in that accomplishment. You know, somebody who inherits money as I did hasn't earned it. I was fortunate that my family had wealth, but I didn't earn that money, and that often has a deleterious effect on character. And so I like these people that gave me, this experience gave me a sense of sort of small d democracy. And I became, I think, in many respects, an average American. I always said I'm not a great man, I'm not a great shooter, I'm not a great rider. I'm an average man who's had extraordinary opportunities in life. And I've made the most of them. That's what's different about me. I've made the most of every opportunity that has ever come my way. I also think that, as I mentioned earlier, that the frontier is the essential element in the American character. And I got out here just when there was a tiny little bit of it left. 15 or 20 years later, I wouldn't have had the opportunity. So I came here when we still had that amazing engine of American greatness here. And I was able to throw myself into this experience and take from it everything that it could bring to me. And so it made me tougher physically, it made me tougher mentally. It made me understand something about the fragility of our forests and our grasses and our rivers and so on. A lot of my conservation was born out here. But when I left New York to come here in the fall of 1883, I had had a difficult summer. I had cholera morbus, which is a form of diarrhea, essentially. It's a digestive problem. And one of the people who met me here for the first time said that I was so thin that you could literally put your hands around my waist. I was fragile. I still was suffering from asthma. I was very uncertain of myself. And because I was uncertain of myself, I was a little over the top in my utterances and behavior. And so this place settled me and made me a real man, because you can't survive here as a man unless you become a real one. There's no place out here for dandies and charlatans. And so those things greatly improved my life. And then finally, one last thing. There are many able people, doubtless hundreds and thousands abler than I was. But I had three things really, that others didn't have. One is almost unbelievable drive. I credit that to my father, but drive, ambition, willingness to throw myself into life, the glory of work and the joy of living. I had that. Henry Cabot Lodge didn't have that. Taft didn't have that. I had it. Secondly, I had the chance to take this frontier dynamism and to transform it into public action, to use it as a way of organizing my career. I was the first cowboy president. Cowboy wasn't quite as romantic a term in my time as it is in yours, but I was the first cowboy president, and that meant that people who were uncertain of my policies or my politics still found me interesting and colorful because I was a cowboy. And it was a good deal of ridicule involved, but I was the most cartooned president of my time. I was invariably cartooned in cowboy gear. People smiled at the very thought of me on a horse and so on. And so that gave me a cachet that I would not have had I been a New York banker or an insurance adjuster. And then finally the war. And I wouldn't probably have gotten myself into the Spanish-American War had it not been here, because the Rough Riders that I created, that I brought together, were a harem-scarum group of cowboys and Indians from out here, and some Yale yachtsmen and some Harvard tennis players, but mostly they were ruffians from the West. And I whipped them into shape, and we took San Juan Hill. We had higher casualties in my volunteer regiment than any other group in Cuba. And I said later, and I think one of you mentioned it today, my only regret was that in that war I did not receive a dangerous and maybe disfiguring wound. Because I think you want that as a badge of your heroism. But when people thought of me as, okay, the trusts or the conservation stuff or the Panama Canal or the Great White Fleet or whatever they thought, okay, but cowboy. This is a cowboy. And this is a war hero. And those things lifted my work over some barriers that might have been more difficult without them. And so for all those reasons and more, I repeat, I would never have been the president of this country had it not been for this experience. But I said something even more important than that. Maybe you've read it. In 1904, I had Albert Fall in, a senator from New Mexico. He was a Westerner, and we knew each other pretty well. And I said to him, if you could keep only one experience of all of the experiences of your entire life in your memory, but every other experience would disappear forever and could never be recovered. If you can keep one and only one experience or adventure from all of the activities of your life, what would you choose? I didn't wait for him to answer. I said, I would choose my life as a cowboy and rancher out on the badlands of Dakota. Without question, that was the most important, most gratifying, most transformative experience of my life, and I wouldn't be here were it not for that time in Dakota. So when people say, last year on this very stage, the president of this institution made a snotty remark about this and said, oh, he probably would have been president anyway. If I weren't a gentleman, I would have punched him in the snout.
Yes, another question.
Mr. President, in our time, in this country and several others, we have women serving in the military, in the front lines, in aircraft, fighting. Can you comment on what your attitude toward that might have been?
Yes, I actually wrote about this. I think it came up earlier today. It did not happen in my time. Women had auxiliary positions in the war, Red Cross or nursing or field hospitals, volunteer associations of one sort or another. My own kin, my own daughters-in-law and daughter made sure that, not Alice of course, made sure that they got themselves to the war. But I've contemplated the time when women would actually enter combat. Now, I don't particularly like that idea, because you think naturally that men, we think of women as delicate and we need to protect them and so on and so forth. But if you actually think it through, those arguments don't ultimately hold up. We know of Amazons who have fought through the history of the world. And so I actually contemplated that the time would come. It did not come in my time when women entered combat situations, and it didn't upset me. That may be the most surprising part of the whole thing, because I'm such a complete warrior at heart. And I think that war is something deeply woven into the character of males, of men. I think every one of us has a little of the wolf in him, every male. And maybe women do too. But I know that when I was going up San Juan Hill, I felt the wolf rising in me. And that is a feeling that you don't get hunting, you don't get climbing Mount Blanc. You get that when you have a rifle and there is a person who's going to kill you. And that is, it's a terrible thing, of course, but it is also a breathtaking, exhilarating, ennobling thing, too. We'll do two more.
Mr. President,
I don't know the answer to that. It's probably Cheyenne, Wyoming. I made a trip through the American West in 1903, and I went to Cheyenne and rode horses and was involved in rodeo things and so on. But this happened all the time. Just like this extraordinary young woman who was wearing the Western garb. These women, one of the areas where women were pioneers was in rodeo and horsemanship. And so they were more active in that than they were in many other so-called male-dominated arenas. And so I was always meeting such people. And I loved to press flesh and to reach down and to talk with these people. It gave me great joy when someone said, "We're with you, Mr. Roosevelt," or "bully for you," or "don't stop." You know, people always would say to me, I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, and I would say, you can never hear it enough. It's not about ego, it's you want the affirmation of the people that you're doing the right thing on their behalf. And when they come up and say how much they appreciate you, and they want you to fight the good fight, and not let the weak ones drag you down, it has a huge effect. But I believe, I won't speak authoritatively, but I believe that was Cheyenne, Wyoming.
I think
Last
it was,
question.
and she was a rodeo star. She had won the championship in that.
Is there a last question? Yes, yeah.
Mr. President,
Take two.
you said several times this evening that you thought that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest president. I'm sure that a number of us might agree with that. But what do you think are the circumstances or characteristics of Abraham Lincoln that made him a great president?
It's a great question. He was a pragmatist. He was not an idealist. If you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it's not what its mythology suggests. Remember that famous letter that he wrote to Horace Greeley before the war? And he said, if I can hold the Union together and keep slavery, I'm going to do that. He said, if I can hold the country together and keep slaves in some states and bar them in others, I'm going to do that. If I can hold this thing together and get rid of slavery, that's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to hold the Union together. That's pragmatism. He was not an idealist. He grew in office. His moral core grew. If you look at the photographs of him, the haunted face, the letters that he wrote to the parents of the fallen, the gallows humor that he used with my Secretary of State, John Hay. This was a man who was deeply touched by war in a way that nobody else in my understanding of American history ever was. He kept his humor, which is probably what saved his life. And he grew over time. And he realized this, and he said this, and I ask you to think about this. This is in the 1858, I believe. He said, Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said, we don't know what Jefferson meant by that. Probably he meant white males of a certain property base. In other words, Jefferson probably didn't really mean it as a universal statement. But he said, it doesn't matter what Jefferson thought, because we have the phrase, and we can't go on as a nation unless we read that in its fullest sense. Whatever it meant to Jefferson or the founding fathers, for us to go on as a nation, we have to read that in the fullest universal sense, and we have to overcome the problem of slavery. We certainly have to keep it out of the American West. And so that ability of pragmatism, humor, he's almost Christ-like in the way that he took all this on as a kind of redemptive burden. His capacity as a prose stylist, there's nothing in Jefferson equal to the second inaugural address. There's nothing in American English equal to the second inaugural address. But the fundamental thing is that he was a pragmatist rather than an idealist. If it had been the other way around, he would never have succeeded in that awful war. The last question was here, someone in the back.
Sharon
here.
had her hand
Yes.
up as well.
Go ahead.
Mr. President, your former chief of staff commented that Edith never made a mistake while she was in the White House. Was it the woman beside you that made the man?
No. Of course not. No, but so I'm in the terrible position of having to find some ground between the absurdity of what you said and the truth. Edith was the perfect wife. She had children. She cared for them greatly, was a tremendous mother, stern but loving. She was better read than I was. I read a book a day, but somehow she was better read. She was a much better judge of character than I was. I was a lousy judge of character, actually. She had political savvy, and she had boundaries, which I had a hard time with. And so she kept me grounded. She also was, and I know this will sound maybe offensive to you, but she knew her place. She did not want to intrude into the whole presidency and be a moment-by-moment partner in discussion and so on. She had no interest in that, but she was willing.
Mr. President, you could say that she was intensely private. That might be nicer than she knew her place.
She knew her place.
I tried.
She was intensely private. And but my point was, before you interrupted, madam, was that she did not want to be a co-president. She did not have any interest in being co-president. She wanted she thought of herself as the mother of our children, my lover, I mean, not just wife, but my lover, and then the First Lady of the United States. She brought arts to the White House, Pablo Casals, Isadora Duncan. My taste in music is papa sorts of stuff. She brought real refinement to all of that. So I was deeply indebted to her in every way. And, I don't know what would have happened to have my first wife lived. I wish she had lived, of course. One hesitates even to talk about this. But she would have been hard-pressed to be as superb a wife as Edith. And if you read the correspondence, now she destroyed much of it, but if you read the correspondence, we were still true lovers deep into the marriage. We weren't companionable. And I would write letters saying she's just as pretty as she was when I met her, maybe prettier and fit and flirtatious and gracious. So, I know that I'm not an easy man to love. I'm constantly roaring off to kill something and explore something and fight the good fight. There's no arena that I don't want to get into. This must have hurt her and frustrated her greatly at times. But she realized, I think, that I hope she realized that it was worth it. But more importantly, she realized that there wasn't anything she could do about it. That if she tried to tame me, that I would shrivel up and be something that was beneath her regard. And so the paradox was that she loved a man who was going to be constantly rushing away somewhere for an adventure. She came on some of them. She came here in 1890. You'll find out more about that tomorrow. But she was the ideal wife and mate, and I feel so fortunate. When my first wife died, I wrote to Corinne and Bamie, and I said, I might spend the rest of my life out in Dakota. I'm certainly not going to come back very often, maybe to work with publishers or to see the child. I said, when I come back, there's one thing I insist upon, that I not encounter Edith. Because we had been so close once, and we had just missed marrying each other. And I knew that if I saw her again, I might be susceptible. I didn't want to be susceptible because I believe that you should have only one marriage. I think second marriages speak concupiscence and a lack of fidelity. And I once said, jocularly, but I kind of meant it, if you marry twice, you have to hope there's no heaven. Because if in heaven you meet everyone you knew in life, there are going to be some awkward moments. So I don't know what would have happened had my first wife lived, but I must say that there's a reason why my first wife does not appear in my autobiography, because in a sense it turned out to be an interlude before a glorious relationship with an amazing woman who deepened me and chastened me and loved me and accepted me for all of my waywardness. And I can tell you this, by way of closing, there is not a chance in the world that I ever was attracted to another woman. can't say that of many of your presidents. But nobody could ever allege that I had a relationship outside of my marriage. I believed in monogamy, and I believed in character. And I believe that I was deeply fortunate to have Edith as my spouse. Madam.
Thank you. Thank you, Clay, our 26th gentleman president.
Accept this, and first of all, thanks to you, Melanie, for being the moderator, and you designed much of this, and thanks to the young women who bring them out, could you? Yourselves one more time.
I've been down to Madison to see the folks and sights. You'd laugh, I'm sure, to hear them talk about the women's rights.
Thank you, ladies, so much for your participation.
Now it's just as plain as my old
Melanie, can I
time,
just do
plain
one
as
quick
plain can
last
be,
thing? I want to ask
that
my
if
three
the
friends
women
here.
want the vote,
This is hard tonight.
they'll
because
get no help from
it's one
me.
thing trying to perform
Not
as
from
Roosevelt,
Joe, not
performing
from
against
Joe,
experts.
if he knows it, not from Joseph, no,
It's
no,
really
no,
very
not from
nerve-wracking.
Joe, not from me, I tell
Truly,
you.
and so I want to ask
no.
you truly, were there areas
Say,
where you
friend
felt,
Joseph, why not we should vote as well as you? But there are no problems in this state that need our wisdom too.
I want to know, and I'm not
We
afraid
must
to hear.
pay our taxes same as you, as citizens be true. And if some wicked thing we do, to jail we're sent by
He
you.
was doing the War of 1812, and he convinced, well, they talked about books. So his uncle James Bullock also wrote a book. And I thought there was a sense that they were feeling that he was missing his father, and there were moments with Bullock, with James Bullock, that avuncular attention was that he was grateful for it and responded to it.
That's great, thank you. How about you, Stacey?
No, I don't think I wouldn't say misinterpreted, Clay. I think that we all held back because of our deep respect for you.
Why hold back? What kind of cheap shot is that? Don't hold back.
I liked him better as President Roosevelt.
Wow. Wow.
Cheap shot.
Wow.
I just think that if we had, I think it would have been it would have been a different night if we really opened up with our deep and more modern concerns about some of the things that Roosevelt said and did.
So name one, so we understand you.
My colleague over there has some questions for you about race suicide.
Well, I feel whiplashed because last night we were having a drink and these two extraordinary women had fundamentally different ideas of race suicide, and I was just like watching a tennis match trying to figure out where I was going to try to put myself.
Tonight I didn't feel the urge to raise my hand or interject at all, but the one thing I wanted to hear more about, and this may just be a question of there's no answer to, but in asking about the contrast between your intellectual justifications for race suicide and what you saw all around you and the women that you knew, I was hoping for like a little more empathy or some sense that you could see that even though intellectually what you wanted was for women to care more than anything about having children, that from your lived experience, you saw in your daughters, in their friends, in the daughters of your friends, and your friends' wives, and the people that your colleagues from Harvard married, that women did not want to do this.
Put it differently.
Yep.
Okay, that her sense, I'm putting words in your mouth now, Kimberly, was that TR appears not to have seen that women were more than mothers, that what women deeply desired more than anything else was to be a mother. And somehow, even though you saw examples of rodeo riders and suffragists and reformers and your own family members around you, you don't have the hat on, I should say, Roosevelt couldn't get past that that as a sort of a great stumbling block in front of him in his thinking.
Right, go ahead.
The writers that I was detailing are people who don't live by those particular rules. You admired them, you worked with them. I'm talking about you as president right now, but that there was a kind of regard for them as equals to you.
I think that's the paradox that we've been toying
man
with
to
here for a
man,
day and a half,
you know?
that he obviously admired these women. He obviously wasn't 100% doctrinaire about these ideas of reproduction and family. He admired independent women. Some of them were in his own very tight blood circle as well as his social circle. And what I thought you were heading with that question was on a different zone. When he went with Jacob Riis to see how the other half lived, and he saw in a tenement on the 5th floor of some brick building in Manhattan without running water and without heat, the windows permanently sealed shut, and children 2 and 3 years old rolling to cigars and dying of typhus and diphtheria. I think he thought, oh boy, it's one thing to talk about these things for people that have the means to raise children, but there are so many people whose lives are so desperate that they're having children as a way of making sure that they have some children who live. I think it changed his way of seeing, and I think he became, I think the big, for me, and I'd be really interested to hear what the three of you think. I think Roosevelt is almost always less doctrinaire than he's been made to seem in almost every subject. That here we have a very highly intellectualized, complex human being who grew over time and changed his mind about a lot of things. And we tend, for whatever reason, maybe he begs us to, we lock him into a certain idea of Theodore Roosevelt, and it makes it hard for us to see through that self-fashioned mythology.
And I don't think it's just that, although I think that's absolutely true. We forget that first and foremost, what was Roosevelt? He was a politician. And even though politician doesn't have exactly the same meaning in 1905 as it does in 2018, Roosevelt could say exactly opposite things on the same subject. He could. I mean, he could say, for example, I had that quote today about Jane Addams. Well, as long as she was still contributing to the world, that was fine. She could be childless, okay. But the same year, he said, mothers are better than nuns, mothers are better than reformers, mothers are better than any other kind of, and frankly, he was suggesting that they barely deserve to live because they didn't have children. Now, where is the politician in Roosevelt? How many of the statements he made, how many of the oppositional statements he made in particular, are because he's responding to a constituency or a challenger?
And he was also trying to keep up with the progressive movement, and at times he got up with it, and at times he fell back. I mean, that whole roller coaster between 1908 and 1916 was a hard time for him.
And every politician in our constitutional republic who's got to get elected has to decide whether or not he or she today is going to speak his own mind, represent himself only, or try to represent his constituency. So that balance, we've never talked about that with Roosevelt. I mean, in part, you brought that up on the quote about Booker T. Washington and Mark Twain, or maybe you did. So where is that balance in Roosevelt? That's been absolutely absent from our talk so far.
Well, we've had so much fun, and I really want to thank the young women who've done this. How great for them to come out and dress in this wonderful way. Thank you, Melanie. Say good night. You take us out.
Good night.